In the 1930s, grandmas made magic meals that mattered. They didn't need fancy recipes. They transformed crackers into apple pie, water into sweet dessert, and turnips into fruit filling. These meals might sound impossible, but they tasted so good families asked for more. Let's rediscover these 30 forgotten transformation meals grandmas made that prove taste doesn't require expensive ingredients. Raisin pie was the Depression-era magic trick that transformed cheap raisins into something that tasted exactly like expensive mincemeat pie without using any meat at all. Grandma soaked raisins in hot water with vinegar, sugar, cinnamon, and cloves until they plumped up and absorbed all the spices, then thickened the mixture with a little cornstarch and poured it into a pie crust. When you baked it and let it cool, the raisins softened into a thick, spiced filling that looked and tasted like traditional mincemeat made with beef, suet, and brandy. Nobody suspected raisins until Grandma revealed her secret ingredient after everyone had seconds. The vinegar added the sharp tang that mincemeat was famous for, while the spices created that warm, complex flavor people expected from holiday pies. It cost around 35 cents to make a whole pie using a box of raisins, while real mincemeat cost triple that during winter when meat was expensive. This wasn't just budget cooking, it was brilliant transformation that proved grandmas understood flavor chemistry before anyone invented food science or knew what was happening in their ovens. Soda cracker pie was the Depression-era dessert miracle that turned plain saltine crackers into a sweet, custardy lemon pie that fooled everyone who tasted it. Grandmas crushed saltines into fine crumbs, mixed them with sugar, cream of tartar, lemon juice, and egg yolks, then poured the mixture into a pie crust and baked it until set. When you cut into it, the crackers had completely transformed. They absorbed the lemon and sugar and turned into a smooth, tangy custard filling that tasted nothing like saltines. The saltiness from the crackers actually enhanced the lemon flavor instead of ruining it, creating that perfect sweet-tart balance that made people ask for the recipe. It cost around 30 cents to make using a sleeve of crackers and one lemon, while real lemon custard pies needed expensive fresh cream and multiple eggs. This transformation proved that grandmas knew salt-enhanced sweetness long before fancy chefs discovered the technique and started sprinkling sea salt on chocolate desserts to make them taste better and more complex and interesting. Before we move on, many of you asked in the comments where to find these recipes. We even received tons of email too, so we published these recipes on our website. The link is in the description. Let's continue. Shoofly pie was the Pennsylvania Dutch Depression-era magic that transformed dark molasses and pretzel crumbs into a gooey, sweet pie that kept families fed when sugar was expensive and fresh fruit was impossible to afford. Grandmas mixed molasses with hot water and baking soda to create a thin, sticky liquid, poured it into a pie crust, then topped it with crumbs made from crushed pretzels, flour, brown sugar, and butter. When it baked, the bottom stayed gooey and wet like syrup, while the top turned crispy and crumbly, creating two different textures in one pie. The molasses provided intense sweetness and deep flavor, while the pretzel crumbs added salt and crunch that balanced everything perfectly. It cost around 40 cents to make using pantry staples, while fruit pies cost double that when apples and berries were out of season. The name came from grandmas having to shoo flies away from the sweet molasses while it cooled on windowsills. This wasn't fancy baking, it was pure genius that turned cheap ingredients into a dessert so good that families still make it today in Pennsylvania Dutch country. Before we continue, Green tomato pie was the Depression-era transformation magic that turned unripe tomatoes from the garden into something that tasted exactly like apple pie without using a single apple. Sliced green tomatoes thin, soaked them in a hot syrup made from sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, lemon juice, and a little vinegar, then layered them into a pie crust and baked it until the tomatoes softened and absorbed all the spices. When you bit into it, the green tomatoes had the same firm texture as cooked apples, and the spices completely masked the tomato flavor and created that classic apple pie taste everyone loved. Nobody suspected tomatoes until Grandma revealed the secret. And even then, people didn't believe her until she showed them the green tomatoes still growing on vines in the backyard garden. It cost around 25 cents to make using tomatoes that would have been thrown away or left to rot since they never ripened before. Frost killed the plants. This transformation proved grandmas could turn garden waste into dessert that tasted expensive and special and made people think you'd gone to the store. Desperation pie was the Depression-era miracle that transformed plain white vinegar into a pie that tasted exactly like lemon meringue without using a single lemon. Grandmas mixed vinegar with sugar, butter, egg yolks, and a little cornstarch, cooked it on the stove until it thickened into a smooth custard, then poured it into a baked pie crust and topped it with meringue made from the leftover egg whites. When you tasted it, the vinegar had completely transformed. It provided the same sharp, tangy flavor that lemons gave to custard pies, but cost almost nothing compared to fresh citrus that was expensive and hard to find during winter. The sugar balanced the vinegar's sourness perfectly, creating that sweet, tart taste people loved in lemon pies. It cost around 20 cents to make using pantry staples, while real lemons cost 10 cents each, and you needed 3 for one pie. This wasn't just poverty cooking, it was brilliant chemistry that proved grandmas understood how acids worked in desserts long before anyone explained pH levels or studied culinary science in fancy cooking schools. These 5 magic pies proved Depression grandmas were transformation geniuses who turned raisins into mincemeat, crackers into lemon custard, molasses into gooey sweetness, green tomatoes into apples, and vinegar into lemon filling. They vanished when real ingredients became affordable, but their cleverness deserves remembering today. Prune whip was the Depression-era dessert magic that transformed cheap dried prunes into a light, fluffy mousse that tasted like expensive French desserts served in fancy restaurants. Grandmas cooked prunes until they were soft, mashed them into a smooth puree, then folded in stiffly beaten egg whites and a little sugar to create a cloud-like dessert that was half fruit, half air. When you spooned it into glasses and chilled it, the prunes completely transformed. They lost their dark, wrinkled appearance and turned into a pale, airy mousse that looked elegant and tasted sweet and fruity without being heavy. The egg whites provided volume and lightness that made a small amount of prunes stretch to feed 6 people instead of 2. It cost around 25 cents to make using a box of dried prunes and eggs from backyard chickens. This transformation proved grandmas knew how to whip egg whites into stiff peaks and fold them into fruit purees long before anyone invented the electric mixer or studied the science of meringues and mousses in culinary school. Tomato soup cake was the Depression-era baking miracle that transformed a can of Campbell's tomato soup into a moist, spiced chocolate cake that nobody suspected came from soup. Grandmas mixed 1 can of condensed tomato soup with flour, sugar, baking soda, cinnamon, cloves, and a little cocoa powder, stirred it together and baked it in a loaf pan until it turned into a tender, fragrant cake. When you sliced it, the tomato soup had completely disappeared. It provided moisture and slight acidity that made the cake incredibly tender, while the spices masked any tomato flavor and created a warm, complex taste that reminded people of gingerbread mixed with chocolate. Nobody guessed soup until Grandma revealed the secret ingredient after everyone asked for her recipe. It cost around 35 cents to make using 1 can of soup, while traditional cakes needed expensive butter, eggs, and milk that strained tight budgets. War cake was the Depression-era and wartime transformation miracle that created a moist, delicious spice cake without using eggs, milk, or butter. 3 ingredients that were rationed or too expensive for most families to afford. Grandma's mixed flour, brown sugar, raisins, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg with water, shortening, and baking soda, then baked it into a dense, fragrant cake that stayed moist for days. When you sliced it, the cake was surprisingly tender despite missing all the usual rich ingredients. The water replaced milk, shortening replaced butter, and the chemical reaction between baking soda and brown sugar created rise without eggs. The raisins added sweetness and moisture, while the spices created complex flavor that made people forget the cake was missing half its normal ingredients. It cost around 30 cents to make using pantry staples, while traditional cakes cost double or triple that when butter and eggs were scarce. This transformation proved Grandmas understood ingredient substitution and chemical leavening long before anyone studied food science or learned that baking soda plus acid creates carbon dioxide that makes cakes rise without eggs. Cracker pudding was the Depression-era dessert transformation that turned stale saltine crackers into something that tasted like rich bread pudding without using bread. Grandmas crushed stale crackers into coarse crumbs, soaked them in hot milk with sugar, vanilla, and a beaten egg, then baked the mixture until it set into a custardy pudding with a golden top. When you spooned into it, the crackers had completely transformed. They absorbed the sweet milk and turned soft and custard-like, losing all their salty cracker taste and becoming a smooth, comforting dessert. The egg provided richness and helped everything set together, while vanilla masked any remaining cracker flavor and made it taste like traditional bread pudding from fancy cookbooks. It cost around 20 cents to make using crackers that would have been thrown away and a little milk and sugar. This transformation proved Grandmas never wasted anything and knew that crackers could replace bread in desserts, creating texture and substance that stretched expensive ingredients like milk and eggs into enough servings to feed the whole family after supper. Grape Nuts pudding was the Depression-era transformation that turned crunchy breakfast cereal into a smooth, custardy baked dessert that tasted nothing like cereal and everything like expensive custard. Grandmas soaked Grape Nuts cereal in hot milk until the hard nuggets softened completely. Then mixed in beaten eggs, sugar, vanilla, and a pinch of salt, poured it into a baking dish, and baked it until it set into a firm custard with a slightly crunchy top. When you scooped it warm from the oven, the grape nuts had completely transformed. They disappeared into the custard and provided texture and nutty flavor without any crunch remaining. The cereal absorbed the sweet milk and turned soft and creamy, creating a dessert that looked and tasted like fancy baked custard served in restaurants. It cost around 35 cents to make using a small box of cereal and eggs, while traditional custards required expensive heavy cream and multiple egg yolks. This transformation proved Grandma's new cereal could replace expensive thickeners and stretchers in desserts, creating substance and flavor that made simple ingredients feel rich and satisfying and special. These 10 magic desserts prove Depression Grandmas transformed prunes into mousse, soup into cake, nothing into war cake, crackers into pudding, and cereal into custard. They vanished when convenience replaced creativity, but their brilliant transformation showed genius that modern cooking forgot when abundance replaced scarcity. Bologna casserole was the Depression-era transformation that turned cheap lunch meat into a baked dinner that felt like a real meal instead of just sandwiches. Grandmas sliced bologna into rounds, layered it in a baking dish with cooked rice or elbow macaroni, canned tomatoes, diced onions, and whatever vegetables were available, then topped everything with breadcrumbs and baked it until the top turned golden and crispy and the whole thing bubbled. When you served it hot from the oven, the bologna had completely transformed. It lost its cold, rubbery sandwich texture and became tender and savory, absorbing the tomato flavor and blending with the rice and vegetables into a cohesive dinner that tasted nothing like lunch meat. The baking process changed the bologna's texture and flavor, making it taste more like ham or sausage than processed meat from a package. Kids who refused bologna sandwiches ate this happily because it looked and tasted different, more like a real casserole from a cookbook than poverty food. It cost around 50 cents to feed 6 people using the cheapest bologna available, a can of tomatoes, and leftover rice or pasta. This transformation proved grandmas knew that baking changed textures and flavors, turning cold cuts into hot dinners that satisfied hunger and made families feel like they were eating real food instead of just cheap fillers that cost pennies at the store. The casserole stretched expensive meat into enough servings for everyone, and leftovers reheated well the next day for lunch or another dinner when grocery money had run completely out. Meat and potato patties were the Depression-era transformation that stretched a tiny amount of ground beef into 8 burger-sized patties by mixing it with mashed potatoes, creating a filling meal from almost nothing. Grandmas mixed 1 cup of cooked ground beef with 3 cups of mashed potatoes, added diced onions, salt, pepper, and a beaten egg to bind everything together, shaped the mixture into flat patties, rolled them in flour or breadcrumbs, and fried them in a little grease until both sides were golden, brown, and crispy. When you bit into them, they tasted like a cross between hamburgers and potato pancakes. The beef provided savory meat flavor while the potatoes added substance and kept the patties moist and tender inside the crispy coating. Nobody complained they weren't all meat burgers, because the combination tasted good and filled stomachs better than tiny, pure beef patties that would have been too small to satisfy anyone. It cost around 45 cents to feed 6 people using a 1/4 pound of ground beef stretched with potatoes, while regular hamburgers would have needed 2 pounds of meat and cost 3 times as much. This transformation proved grandmas were mathematical geniuses who understood ratios and proportions. They knew exactly how much potato to add to make the meat stretch without making the patties taste bland or fall apart during cooking. The egg acted as a binder that held everything together, while frying created a crust that sealed in moisture and flavor and made them look and taste like real restaurant food instead of leftovers mixed together out of desperation when the grocery budget disappeared. Cornmeal mush cakes were the Depression-era transformation that turned leftover breakfast porridge into crispy fried cakes that tasted completely different from the soft mush families ate that morning. Grandmas cooked cornmeal in boiling salted water until it thickened into a thick porridge, poured it into a loaf pan to cool and solidify overnight, then sliced the firm mush into half-inch slices and fried them in hot grease until both sides turned golden brown and crispy. When you served them hot, the mush had completely transformed. The outside was crunchy like fried potatoes, while the inside stayed soft and creamy, and the frying added rich flavor that plain boiled mush never had. Families ate them for breakfast with maple syrup or molasses, or for dinner topped with gravy or canned tomatoes, proving the same ingredient could become different meals depending on how you cooked it. It cost around 15 cents to make enough for 2 meals using just cornmeal, water, salt, and a little cooking grease saved from previous meals. This transformation proved grandmas never wasted anything and understood that texture mattered as much as flavor. By changing soft mush into crispy cakes, they created variety and interest that made families willing to eat the same ingredient twice in one day without complaining. The solidifying and slicing technique showed genius planning. Making extra mush at breakfast meant having ready to fry cakes, waiting in the icebox for the next meal. Baked bean loaf was the Depression-era transformation that turned canned beans into something that looked and tasted like meatloaf without using any meat at all. Grandmas drained and mashed 2 cans of pork and beans, mixed them with breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, diced onions, a beaten egg, ketchup, and seasonings like salt, pepper, and a little mustard, shaped the mixture into a loaf, placed it in a baking pan, topped it with more ketchup, and baked it until the outside formed a firm crust and the inside set into a sliceable loaf. When you cut into it, the beans had completely transformed. They lost their individual bean texture and melded into a cohesive loaf that sliced cleanly like meatloaf and tasted savory and rich, despite containing no meat. The ketchup on top caramelized during baking and created a sweet, tangy glaze that made it look like real meatloaf fresh from a restaurant kitchen. It cost around 40 cents to feed 6 people using canned beans, while real meatloaf needed expensive ground beef and cost 3 times as much. This transformation proved grandmas understood protein substitution long before anyone invented vegetarian cooking or started talking about plant-based diets. They knew beans provided protein and substance that could replace meat when budgets required it. The egg and breadcrumbs acted as binders that held the mashed beans together and prevented the loaf from falling apart when you sliced, while the seasonings added flavor complexity that made people forget they were eating beans instead of beef and actually enjoy this meatless dinner without feeling deprived or hungry afterward. Egg gravy was the Depression-era transformation that turned scrambled eggs into a creamy, savory gravy that served as a complete dinner when poured over bread, biscuits, or potatoes instead of being just a side dish. Grandmas made a simple white gravy by cooking flour in bacon grease or butter until it browned slightly, then slowly whisking in milk until it thickened into a smooth sauce, seasoning it with salt and lots of black pepper, then scrambling beaten eggs directly into the hot gravy, stirring constantly until the eggs cooked into soft curds throughout the creamy sauce. When you ladled it over thick slices of bread or split biscuits, the egg gravy had transformed scrambled eggs from breakfast food into dinner gravy that provided protein and richness without any meat. The flour-thickened gravy made a small number of eggs stretch to feed 4 people instead of just 2, while the milk added calcium and made everything creamy and satisfying. It cost around 20 cents to feed 4 people using eggs, flour, and milk, while meat gravy required expensive beef or sausage. This transformation proved grandmas knew eggs were complete protein that could replace meat in any meal, not just breakfast, and that changing the format and presentation made families accept eggs for dinner without complaining they wanted real meat. The gravy technique showed brilliant thinking. By scrambling eggs into thick sauce instead of serving them plain, grandmas created substance and volume that made the meal feel more filling and substantial, and turned simple ingredients into comfort food that satisfied hunger and tasted rich. These 15 transformation meals proved Depression grandmas were geniuses who turned bologna into casserole, tiny meat into 8 patties, mush into crispy cake, beans into meatloaf, and eggs into dinner gravy. They vanished when meat became affordable, but their stretching brilliance deserves remembering today. Scrapple was the Depression-era transformation that turned meat scraps nobody wanted into sliceable breakfast meat that fried up crispy and delicious. Grandmas collected all the bits of pork that couldn't be used for anything else, organ meats, trimmings, fat, skin, even the head meat, boiled everything until it was tender enough to shred, mixed the shredded meat with cornmeal and spices like sage, thyme, salt, and pepper, cooked the mixture until it thickened into a thick mush, then poured it into loaf pans to cool and solidify overnight into firm blocks. When morning came, they sliced the scrapple into half-inch slices and fried them in a hot skillet until both sides turned dark brown and crispy. When you bit into it, the scrapple had completely transformed worthless scraps into something that tasted like savory sausage patties. The outside was crunchy and caramelized, while the inside side stayed soft and meaty, and the cornmeal stretched the expensive meat into twice as many servings. It cost around 35 cents to make 12 slices using scraps that would have been thrown away or fed to pigs, while store-bought sausage cost that much for just 4 links. This transformation proved grandmas wasted absolutely nothing and understood that proper seasoning and cooking technique could turn even the least desirable parts of an animal into food that families actually wanted to eat for breakfast instead of just tolerating it because nothing else was available, and hunger made everything taste better than usual. Onion pie was the Depression-era transformation that turned cheap yellow onions into a savory custard pie that tasted rich and satisfying despite containing no meat or expensive ingredient. Grandmas sliced 4 or 5 large onions thin, cooked them slowly in a little butter or bacon grease until they softened and turned golden and sweet, spread them in a pie crust, poured a mixture of beaten eggs and milk over the onions, seasoned everything with salt, pepper, and a pinch of nutmeg, then baked it until the custard set firm and the top turned golden brown. When you sliced it warm from the oven, the onions had completely transformed. They lost their sharp raw flavor and became sweet and tender, blending with the egg custard into a savory pie that tasted like the filling from expensive quiche served in French restaurants. The eggs provided protein that made it a complete meal instead of just a side dish, while the crust added substance that filled stomachs better than soup or salad. It cost around 30 cents to feed 6 people using onions, eggs, and a homemade pie crust, while meat pies needed expensive beef or chicken and cost triple that amount. This transformation proved grandmas understood that onions became sweet when cooked slowly, losing their harsh bite and developing complex flavor that didn't need meat to taste good. The egg and milk custard technique showed sophistication. By treating onions like a quiche filling instead of just a vegetable side dish, grandmas elevated humble ingredients into something that looked elegant enough to serve to company and tasted rich enough to satisfy working men. Pinto bean sausage was the Depression-era transformation that turned cooked pinto beans into breakfast sausage patties that tasted surprisingly similar to real pork sausage. Grandmas mashed 2 cups of cooked pinto beans until mostly smooth, mixed them with flour, sage, thyme, black pepper, salt, a little onion powder, and red pepper flakes for heat, shaped the mixture into small flat patties like sausage, and fried them in hot grease until both sides turned brown and developed a crispy crust. When you served them with eggs and biscuits for breakfast, the bean patties had transformed into something that looked and tasted remarkably like sausage. The sage and thyme provided that classic sausage flavor. The frying created a browned crust that added savory depth, and the texture was similar, enough that families accepted them as sausage substitute without complaining they wanted real meat. It cost around 25 cents to make 12 patties using dried beans that cost pennies per pound, while real pork sausage cost 50 cents for the same amount. This transformation proved grandmas understood flavor profiles and knew exactly which spices made foods taste like meat, even when they contained no meat at all. Sage and thyme were the secret to sausage flavor, not pork. The frying technique created a Maillard reaction that added meaty, savory notes that made the beans taste richer and more complex than boiled beans ever could, showing grandmas understood cooking chemistry long before anyone studied food science or explained why browning makes everything taste better and more interesting. Eggplant mock oysters were the Depression-era transformation that turned garden eggplant into something that tasted remarkably similar to fried oysters without using any seafood. Grandma's peeled eggplant, sliced it into rounds about half an inch thick, soaked the slices in salted water for 15 minutes to remove bitterness, drained and patted them dry, dipped each slice in beaten egg, then rolled it in crushed crackers seasoned with salt and pepper, and of lemon juice, a pinch of cinnamon, and a dash of nutmeg. The turnips absorbed the sweet, spiced liquid as they cooked, losing their sharp raw bite and softening into tender, translucent cubes that looked almost identical to cooked apples. After 30 minutes of slow simmering, the turnip pieces were spooned into pie crusts, layered into crisps, or served warm in bowls with a drizzle of the cooking syrup. Families who couldn't afford real apples, which cost 15 to 20 cents per pound during the Depression, used turnips instead, because turnips grew easily in cold weather and cost only 5 cents per pound at farm stands. Children eating mock apple pie never noticed the substitution. The cinnamon, sugar, and lemon masked the turnip's natural flavors so completely that the filling tasted sweet, tangy, and fruity. The recipe circulated widely through community cookbooks, county extension bulletins, and word of mouth among farm wives who needed to stretch their household budgets. Mock apple pies appeared at church bake sales, school socials, and holiday dinners throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. After the war, when apples became affordable again and grocery stores offered fresh fruit year-round, the turnip version quietly disappeared. Today, almost no one remembers that turnips were once disguised as apples, and the recipe survives only in vintage community cookbooks and handwritten recipe cards tucked into old kitchen drawers. Turnip mock apples prove that Depression-era cooks were brilliant at transformation. They could take a humble root vegetable and, with a little sugar, spice, and patience, turn it into a dessert that tasted like autumn orchard fruit, fooling both the tongue and the memory. The recipe remains a testament to the creativity and determination of families who refused to let poverty rob them of sweetness and comfort. Grandmothers would enter their mock apple pies in county fair competitions, and judges would award blue ribbons, never suspecting that the apple filling contained not a single piece of fruit from an orchard. Potato candy was one of the most magical Depression-era sweets because it transformed leftover mashed potatoes into smooth, creamy fudge-like candy that tasted nothing like potatoes and fooled everyone who tried it. Grandmothers started with 2 tablespoons of cold, plain mashed potato, no butter, no milk, just cooked potato, then gradually stirred in powdered sugar, adding cup after cup until the mixture formed a thick, pliable dough that resembled fondant. The potato acted as a binder, holding the sugar together without any eggs, butter, or expensive ingredients, and the final dough was completely smooth, odorless, and ivory white. Once the dough reached the right consistency, grandmothers rolled it out flat on a countertop dusted with powdered sugar, spread a thin layer of peanut butter across the surface, then rolled the sheet into a tight log, sliced it into rounds, and chilled the pieces until firm. The finished candy looked like miniature pinwheel cookies, with spirals of white fondant and brown peanut butter, and tasted rich, sweet, and nutty. No one could detect any hint of potato flavor. Families made potato candy for holiday gifts, church bake sales, and birthday treats because the ingredients cost almost nothing. Leftover mashed potato was free, powdered sugar cost 10 cents per pound, and peanut butter cost 15 cents per jar. Children loved the candy's creamy texture and sweet peanut butter filling, and neighbors who received it as gifts marveled that such elegant confections could come from a Depression-era kitchen. The recipe spread rapidly through community cookbooks, radio homemaking shows, and word of mouth among mothers looking for inexpensive treats to brighten their children's lives. After the 1950s, when store-bought candy became affordable and families no longer needed to improvise desserts from leftovers, potato candy quietly vanished. Today, most people have never heard of it, and those who discover the recipe are shocked that mashed potatoes can turn into fudge. Potato candy proves that Depression-era grandmothers were kitchen magicians. They could take the plainest leftovers and transform them into sweets that tasted like pure indulgence, bringing a little joy into hard times and proving that creativity could triumph over scarcity every single time. Teachers would receive boxes of potato candy from grateful students at Christmas, and the sweets were so beautiful and delicious that no one ever guessed the secret ingredient had come from last night's dinner plate. Depression donuts were humble, fried treats made from leftover biscuit dough or simple flour and water dough, cut into rings, fried in a few inches of hot lard or vegetable shortening, then rolled in cinnamon sugar while still warm. Grandmothers saved scraps of biscuit dough from breakfast, re-rolled the pieces, cut out donut shapes with a drinking glass and a bottle cap, then dropped the rings into a cast iron skillet of shimmering fat. The dough puffed and browned in seconds, emerging golden, crispy on the outside and soft inside, transforming plain biscuit dough into a bakery-style treat. If there was no leftover dough, grandmothers mixed a quick batch from flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, a spoonful of sugar, and enough water or milk to form a soft dough, then rolled, cut, and fried it immediately. The entire process took less than 15 minutes, and the cost was minimal. Flour cost 5 cents per pound, lard was saved from cooking pork, and cinnamon sugar was a few pennies worth of spice. Families ate depression donuts warm from the skillet, dunked them in coffee, or packed them in school lunchboxes. Children thought they were getting real bakery donuts, never realizing their mothers had made them from yesterday's leftover biscuit scraps. The recipe was wildly popular during the Depression and wartime rationing because it required no eggs, no butter, and no yeast, just pantry staples and a bit of hot fat. Church ladies fried hundreds of depression donuts for bake sales, school fundraisers, and community socials, selling them for a penny apiece. After the 1950s, when commercial donut shops opened in every town and families could buy a dozen glazed donuts for 50 cents, homemade depression donuts disappeared. Today, the recipe survives only in vintage community cookbooks and handwritten cards, a reminder that grandmothers could transform leftover biscuit dough into something that tasted like a special treat, proving that magic in the kitchen didn't require expensive ingredients, just a hot skillet, a little sugar, and the resourcefulness to turn scraps into something wonderful that brought smiles to children's faces and warmth to family kitchens during the hardest times imaginable. Mothers would fry these on Saturday mornings, and the smell of hot sugar and fried dough would draw neighbors to the back door, hoping for a warm donut and a cup of coffee, proving that even the simplest foods could build community and connection. These 5 genius transformations, carrot marmalade, parsnip mock bananas, turnip mock apples, potato candy, and depression donuts prove grandmothers were kitchen magicians. They turned humble root vegetables and leftover dough into marmalade, fruit, fudge, and bakery treats that fooled entire families. Let's see 5 more transformations that stretched ingredients even further. Sour cream raisin pie was a Depression-era classic that transformed inexpensive raisins and homemade sour cream into a creamy, custard-like pie filling that rivaled expensive cream pies from bakeries. Grandmothers soaked plump raisins in warm water to soften them, then drained and mixed them into a custard base made from sour cream or glöckmilch, egg yolks, white sugar, a tablespoon of flour or cornstarch for thickening, a pinch of cinnamon, and a dash of nutmeg. The mixture was cooked gently on the stovetop, stirring constantly, until it thickened into a glossy, spoonable custard flecked with dark raisins. The filling was poured into a pre-baked pie crust, usually lard-based pastry, then topped with soft meringue made from leftover egg whites, whipped with a spoonful of sugar, and browned quickly in the oven. The finished pie was creamy, sweet tart, and studded with chewy raisins with a cloud of golden meringue on top. Families served sour cream raisin pie for Sunday dinners, holiday meals, and church potlucks, and the recipe was beloved because it required no exotic ingredients. Raisins cost 10 cents per box. Sour cream was made at home. Depression donuts were humble, fried treats made from leftover biscuit dough or simple flour and water dough, cut into rings, fried in a few inches of hot lard or vegetable shortening, then rolled in cinnamon sugar while still warm. Grandmothers saved scraps of biscuit dough from breakfast, re-rolled the pieces, cut out donut shapes with a drinking glass and a bottle cap, then dropped the rings into a cast iron skillet of shimmering fat. The dough puffed and browned in seconds, emerging golden, crispy on the outside and soft inside, transforming plain biscuit dough into a bakery-style treat. If there was no leftover dough, grandmothers mixed a quick batch from flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, a spoonful of sugar, and enough water or milk to form a soft dough, then rolled, cut, and fried it immediately. The entire process took less than 15 minutes, and the cost was minimal. Flour cost 5 cents per pound, lard was saved from cooking pork, and cinnamon sugar was a few pennies worth of spice. Families ate depression doughnuts warm from the skillet, dunked them in coffee, or packed them in school lunchboxes. Children thought they were getting real bakery doughnuts, never realizing their mothers had made them from yesterday's leftover biscuit scraps. The recipe was wildly popular during the Depression and wartime rationing because it required no eggs, no butter, and no yeast, just pantry staples and a bit of hot fat. Church ladies fried hundreds of Depression doughnuts for bake sales, school fundraisers, and community socials, selling them for a penny apiece. After the 1950s, when commercial donut shops opened in every town and families could buy a dozen glazed donuts for 50 cents, homemade Depression doughnuts disappeared. Today, the recipe survives only in vintage community cookbooks and handwritten cards. A reminder that grandmothers could transform leftover biscuit dough into something that tasted like a special treat, proving that magic in the kitchen didn't require expensive ingredients. Just a hot skillet, a little sugar, and the resourcefulness to turn scraps into something wonderful that brought smiles to children's faces and warmth to family kitchens during the hardest times imaginable. Mothers would fry these on Saturday mornings, and the smell of hot sugar and fried dough would draw neighbors to the back door, hoping for a warm donut and a cup of coffee, proving that even the simplest foods could build community and connect. These 5 genius transformations, carrot marmalade, parsnip mock bananas, turnip mock apples, potato candy, and Depression doughnuts, prove grandmothers were kitchen magicians. They turned humble root vegetables and leftover dough into marmalade, fruit, fudge, and bakery treats that fooled entire families. Let's see 5 more transformations that stretched ingredients. Sour cream raisin pie was a Depression-era classic that transformed inexpensive raisins and homemade sour cream into a creamy, custard-like pie filling that rivaled expensive cream pies from bakeries. Grandmothers soaked plump raisins in warm water to soften them, then drained and mixed them into a custard base made from sour cream or milk, egg yolks, white sugar, a tablespoon of flour or cornstarch for thickening, a pinch of cinnamon, and a dash of nutmeg. The mixture was cooked gently on the stovetop, stirring constantly, until it thickened into a glossy, spoonable custard flecked with dark raisins. The filling was poured into a pre-baked pie crust, usually lard-based pastry, then topped with soft meringue made from leftover egg whites, whipped with a spoonful of sugar, and browned quickly in the oven. The finished pie was creamy, sweet tart, and studded with chewy raisins with a cloud of golden meringue on top. Families served sour cream raisin pie for Sunday dinners, holiday meals, and church potlucks, and the recipe was beloved because it required no exotic ingredients. Raisins cost 10 cents per box. Sour cream was made at home by letting fresh milk sit until it clabbered. Eggs came from backyard. Chickens and flour and sugar were pantry staples. The pie tasted rich and luxurious, as if it had come from a fancy bakery, but the entire dessert cost less than 50 cents to make and fed 8 people. During the Depression, when store-bought pies cost $1 or more, sour cream raisin pie was a budget miracle. The recipe circulated widely through community cookbooks, county fair prize collections, and handwritten cards passed among neighbors.
After the 1950s, when families could afford richer desserts made with chocolate, cream cheese, and fresh fruit, sour cream raisin pie quietly faded from menus. Today, the recipe is almost entirely forgotten, and most younger cooks have never tasted it. Sour cream raisin pie proves that Depression-era bakers were experts at transformation. They could take humble raisins, clabbered milk, and a few eggs, and create a dessert that tasted like pure indulgence, proving that elegance and comfort could emerge from the simplest ingredients when handled
with skill, care, and love. Church ladies would bring these pies to potluck dinners, and the dessert table would empty quickly as families returned for second slices, marveling at how something so simple could taste so wonderfully rich and satisfying. Cornstarch custard, also called blancmange, was a Depression-era dessert that transformed cornstarch, milk, and sugar into a smooth, creamy pudding that rivaled expensive egg-based custards without using a single egg. Grandmothers whisked cornstarch with cold milk to make a slurry, then heated the remaining milk with sugar and a pinch of salt until it steamed. The cornstarch slurry was slowly poured into the hot milk, whisking constantly, and the mixture thickened almost instantly into a glossy, pourable custard. A splash of vanilla extract was stirred in at the end, and the custard was poured into individual glass dishes or a single serving bowl, then chilled until set. The finished dessert was ivory white, silky smooth, and delicately sweet, with a texture almost identical to egg custard. Families ate blancmange plain, topped it with a spoonful of jam, or layered it with canned fruit for a fancier presentation. The recipe was wildly popular during the Depression because it required no eggs, which cost precious pennies and were often saved for baking bread, and no butter or cream. Cornstarch cost only 5 cents per box, milk was delivered daily for pennies, and vanilla extract was a few drops from a bottle that lasted months. Children loved the smooth, cool custard, and mothers appreciated that it could be made in 20 minutes without any complicated techniques or expensive ingredients. Blancmange appeared in nearly every Depression-era cookbook, county extension pamphlet, and homemaking magazine, often accompanied by variations that added cocoa powder for chocolate custard or lemon zest for citrus flavor. After the 1950s, when instant pudding mixes hit grocery shelves and families could make dessert by stirring a powder into cold milk, homemade cornstarch custard disappeared. Today, the recipe is almost entirely forgotten, and most people have never heard the word blancmange. Cornstarch custard proves that Depression-era cooks were brilliant at transformation. They could take a box of cornstarch and a quart of milk and create a dessert that tasted as elegant as anything made with eggs and cream, demonstrating that luxury and comfort could be conjured from the simplest pantry staples with just a little patience and know-how. Mothers would serve this custard in their best glass dishes for Sunday dinner, and guests would compliment the elegant dessert, never suspecting that it cost only pennies to make and required no rare or expensive ingredients. Chicory coffee was a Depression-era substitute that transformed dried chicory root into a dark, bitter brew that closely mimicked real coffee, allowing families to stretch expensive coffee grounds or replace them entirely when budgets were tight. Grandmothers dug chicory roots from roadsides and fields. Chicory was a common wild plant with bright blue flowers, then scrubbed, peeled, and chopped the roots into small pieces. The root pieces were spread on a baking sheet and roasted slowly in a low oven until they turned deep brown and released a toasted, nutty aroma. Once cooled, the roasted roots were ground in a hand-crank coffee mill, producing a coarse, dark powder that looked almost identical to ground coffee. Grandmothers brewed chicory coffee the same way they brewed regular coffee, spooning the ground chicory into a percolator. Once cooled, the roasted roots were ground in a hand-crank coffee mill, producing a coarse, dark powder that looked almost identical to ground coffee. Grandmothers brewed chicory coffee the same way they brewed regular coffee, spooning the ground chicory into a percolator or boiling it in a pot of water, then straining out the grounds. The resulting brew was dark, strong, and slightly bitter, with earthy, woody notes that closely resembled coffee. Families drank chicory coffee black, sweetened it with a spoonful of sugar, or lightened it with a splash of milk. The taste was different from real coffee, slightly more bitter and less aromatic, but it was hot, dark, and caffeinated enough to wake people up in the morning. During the Depression, when real coffee cost 25 cents per pound and many families couldn't afford it, chicory coffee was free, harvested from the wild and prepared at home. The recipe was especially popular in the South, where chicory had been used as a coffee extender since the Civil War, and New Orleans families blended chicory with real coffee to stretch their supplies. After World War II, when coffee rationing ended and prices dropped, most families abandoned chicory and returned to pure coffee. Today, chicory coffee survives only in New Orleans cafe au lait and specialty blends. Chicory coffee proves that Depression-era cooks could transform a roadside weed into a breakfast staple that kept families caffeinated and warm, demonstrating that resourcefulness and knowledge of wild plants could provide comfort and routine even when money was scarce and store-bought luxuries were out of reach. Farmers would gather chicory roots in late summer, dry and roast them in bulk, and store jars of ground chicory in the pantry to last through the winter, ensuring that every morning could start with a hot cup of something that tasted remarkably like the real thing, even when the real thing was simply too expensive to buy. Mock pecan pie was a Depression-era masterpiece that transformed oats or crushed crackers into a pie filling that looked, tasted, and felt almost identical to expensive Southern pecan pie, fooling guests at holiday dinners and church socials. Grandmothers made a simple syrup filling from dark corn syrup or brown sugar, butter, eggs, and vanilla extract, then stirred in toasted rolled oats or coarsely crushed soda crackers to mimic the texture and crunch of pecans. The oats or crackers absorbed the sweet syrup as the pie baked, softening into chewy, caramel-coated pieces that looked like chopped nuts and provided the same satisfying crunch. The filling was poured into a lard pastry crust and baked until the top turned golden and the center set into a glossy, firm custard. The finished pie was rich, sweet, and nutty tasting, with a texture so close to real pecan pie that most people couldn't tell the difference. Families served mock pecan pie at Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Sunday dinners, and guests often asked for the recipe, shocked to learn there were no pecans in the filling. Real pecans cost 50 cents per pound during the Depression, far too expensive for most families, but rolled oats cost 5 cents per box, and soda crackers cost 10 cents per box, making mock pecan pie an affordable luxury. The recipe circulated widely through community cookbooks, county extension bulletins, and homemaking magazines, and it became a holiday staple in rural kitchens across the South and Midwest. After the 1950s, when pecans became more affordable and families could buy real pecan pie from bakeries or make it at home without substitutions, mock pecan pie quietly disappeared. Today, the recipe is almost entirely forgotten, surviving only in vintage cookbooks and handwritten cards. Mock pecan pie proves that Depression-era bakers were transformation geniuses. They could take humble oats or crackers and, with a little syrup and patience, create a dessert that tasted like Southern tradition, proving that luxury didn't require expensive ingredients, just ingenuity, creativity, and the determination to bring sweetness and celebration into hard times no matter what the budget allowed. Grandmothers would bake these pies for church Thanksgiving dinners, and ministers would praise the dessert from the pulpit, never suspecting that the pecan pie on the fellowship hall table contained not a single pecan, just rolled oats and the resourcefulness of women who refused to let poverty steal the joy of holiday traditions. Hoosier cream pie, also called sugar cream pie, was a Depression-era Indiana classic that transformed simple pantry staples, cream, sugar, flour, and butter, into a rich, custardy pie filling that rivaled expensive French cream pies without requiring eggs or fancy techniques. Grandmothers whisked together heavy cream or half and half, white sugar, a few tablespoons of flour or cornstarch for thickening, a pinch of salt, and a splash of vanilla extract, then poured the mixture into an unbaked pie crust. Dots of butter were scattered across the top, and the pie was baked slowly until the filling thickened, bubbled, and turned golden brown on the surface. As the pie cooled, the filling set into a smooth, sliceable custard with a caramelized top and a creamy, sweet interior. Families served Hoosier cream pie at Sunday dinners, church potlucks, and holiday gatherings, and the dessert was beloved because it required no eggs, which were often saved for baking bread, and no expensive flavorings or spices. The entire pie cost less than 50 cents to make and fed 8 people, making it an affordable luxury during hard times. The recipe was especially popular in Indiana farm kitchens, where fresh cream was abundant from dairy cows, and the pie became a regional specialty. Home cooks across the Midwest adopted the recipe, and it appeared in countless community cookbooks and county fair competitions. After the 1950s, when families could afford richer desserts made with chocolate, cream cheese, and fresh fruit, Hoosier cream pie quietly faded from menus. Today, the pie is still made occasionally in Indiana and among Amish communities, but most younger cooks have never heard of it. Hoosier cream pie proves that Depression-era bakers were masters of transformation. They could take a cup of cream, a handful of sugar, and a bit of flour, and create a dessert that tasted like pure indulgence, proving that elegance didn't require complexity. Just simple ingredients handled with care, love, and the wisdom passed down through generations of resourceful grandmothers who knew how to bring comfort and sweetness into any kitchen, no matter how tight the budget or how hard the times. Farm wives would bring Hoosier cream pies to harvest suppers and barn raisings, and neighbors would linger at the dessert table, savoring every bite of the silky custard and marveling that something so simple could taste so rich, so comforting, and so deeply satisfying, proving that true. Hospitality and generosity didn't require wealth, just a willingness to share what you had and make it beautiful. These 30 Depression-era meals prove our grandmothers were kitchen geniuses who could transform carrots into marmalade, turnips into apples, and leftover mashed potatoes into candy that tasted like fudge. They didn't need fancy ingredients or expensive grocery hauls. They used what grew in the garden, what sat in the pantry, and what most people would throw away. Every recipe in this collection fed families for pennies, stretched budgets through impossible times, and brought sweetness and comfort into kitchens where money was scarce, but love was abundant. These transformations weren't just about saving money. They were about refusing to let hard times steal joy from the dinner table. Now, it's your turn. Pick one recipe from this list, maybe mock pecan pie or potato candy, and make it this weekend. Taste the magic your grandmother tasted. Feel the pride she felt when she served something beautiful made from almost nothing. Share the recipe with your family. Teach your children that creativity matters more than money, and that the best meals come from resourcefulness, not a shopping cart. These recipes fed America through the hardest times in history. Don't let them disappear. Make one today. Tag us with your results. Keep these genius transformations alive.